Hi, everyone. I'm Linda Solomon Wood. I'm founder and editor-in-chief of Canada's National Observer, and this is Conversations. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. On February 24th, the Ukraine government announced Russian airstrikes in Kyiv, and Alberta Premier Jason Kenney responded immediately with affirmations that Alberta oil is better than dictator oil. We've seen a lot of tragedy unfold over the last 20 days. It's been heartbreaking. We've also seen oil prices shoot up to $140 per barrel. So tonight, we're going to be talking with some very smart reporters and our columnists, our lead columnist, about, is this a turning point for the fossil-fueled global economy? Could this be the moment that the world turns to alternative energy sources? And how is the climate crisis intersecting with the war? I'd like to introduce you to our panelists tonight. We've got CNO reporters John Woodside and Natasha Bulowski. John is in Vancouver right now visiting, but he lives and works in Ottawa. Natasha is in Ottawa. And we have Max Fawcett, who's joining us from Calgary. So hi, everybody.
Hello.
Thanks for being with us today. Hi, Max, John, Natasha. Are you there?
It's good to be here.
We are here.
Yeah. Hey.
Raring to go.
Hi. Okay. Well, so we'll get right into it with a question for Natasha. You're in Ottawa, Natasha, and keeping a close watch on question period and Parliament. How would you describe the political climate right now in our capital?
Well, before the really impactful address by President Zelensky today, it was quite disheartening, to be honest, to be watching question period. I had seen, like you said, how politicians and lobbyists alike really jumped onto Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a rallying cry for the essentially pro-pipeline agenda. But I guess I'd hoped for more from our politicians in the House, although maybe I shouldn't have, because I've just seen a lot of really broad sweeping statements that don't necessarily have a lot of basis in reality.
Do you feel like they're disconnected or just capitalizing on the situation? What's going on in their heads?
Based on what I've seen and what I've spoken to with experts, I would say it's more capitalizing, unfortunately, because there's really no way to pretend that Canadian oil and gas can swoop into the rescue for Europe right now. It's obviously a problem that so much of their oil and gas comes from Russia, but that's not something Canada is in a position to fix this year or next year. These are infrastructure projects that take a really long time. And, I don't think that, the Conservative Party, for example, is blind to that. You'd quite frankly need to have your head in the sand not to realize that the timelines just don't match up.
You sat down with Environment and Climate Change Minister Stephen Guilbeault recently. What did he have to say about all this, and what was his mood?
Well, like I said, it was pretty straightforward for him. And that was also the day I'd like to note that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its really sobering report. It's been referred to as an atlas of human suffering. John wrote a great explainer about it. And I mean, it's that same day in the House, people were making, claims that we need to ramp up oil and gas production and export. And Guilbeault was very quick to say, anyone who thinks we're going to get out of either, all these conjoined crises, COVID, the war, and of course, oh my God, I agree. COVID, the war, and of course the climate crisis, we're crazy to think that we can get out of one by exacerbating another. So he said anyone who thinks that building more pipelines is the solution is just incredibly mistaken, and that we really need to be doubling down, not just on ramping down fossil fuel production, but rapidly increasing renewables as the only way to really achieve global energy security.
Whether they follow through with that or not, I mean, you have to give them credit for sounding sane when, right? And what sense did you get from him about like what is the government's approach going to be to these kind of intersecting emergencies and what their priorities will be?
Well, it's kind of hard to say right now, honestly, because we haven't been getting a straight answer on Bay du Nord, which will be a carbon bomb, and anyone who knows anything about the climate emergency knows that that's really not a viable option for us right now. So, on one hand, he is saying all the right things, and I think he knows the right answers, but it still kind of remains to be seen whether we're going to go in the right direction. I don't know how much of a role we have to play, in terms of exporting energy to Europe and things like that. But at home, we definitely can't be perpetuating, fossil fuel production. And there's been acknowledgement of that, but also, some denial there in how we're handling these projects.
Thanks, Natasha. And John, how does this correspond to your tracking of the story?
Canadian fossil fuels do not have a role to play here, really. Europe is looking to decarbonize, right? I mean, the countries are recognizing that energy independence from fossil fuels is how you can maintain security, because there are inherent security vulnerabilities when you're critically dependent on another country, particularly like an adversary in this case. That is a strategic liability, whereas no one is controlling the sun or the wind. That is, if you can harness that in your own borders, that's a lot easier.
We were warned years ago that climate would be one of the key drivers of global instability, security issues. That it was going to cause wars and mass migrations. And do you feel like the situation in Ukraine and with Russia is an outgrowth of that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I think has kind of been lost in the recent invasion is that we've covered this. It is out there, but it is about how the Russian war chest is built up through fossil fuels. I mean, we need to remember that Russia is a fossil fuel superpower, right? 90% of the gas burned in the European Union, for example, is imported. About half of that is from Russia. Or oil. Russia is the third largest producer of oil, behind Saudi Arabia and the United States, and it is also the world's top oil exporter, right? So it is a critically dependent part of the Russian economy, which is how they've been able to amass the war chest to pull off this invasion. But I think the kind of important thing here, because I think that is sort of I think that's illustrative of how there is a security issue here with fossil fuels. But I think if we look back, if you do look back, actually, you'll see that the 2014 invasion of Crimea, that was also preceded by a run in the price of oil, as was the 2008 invasion of Georgia. The past couple times Russia has done this, it has come from a mix of expressing and signaling that this was going to happen. I mean, Russia's been building up troops on the border for the past year. At the same time, it's been exploiting the leverage it has over Europe. It pushed gas supplies down, supply levels down in Europe so that it would have more leverage at this particular time. Fossil fuels are I mean, it's really, really critical, and we're really, really starting to see just how vulnerable countries are in this era of transition.
Yeah, that's so interesting because, we're literally seeing people, shot dead, in this conflict, which, if I'm hearing you right, you're saying is at its heart driven by energy issues.
Yeah, I think if, there's a lot of factors that would go into it, but the ability to to actually carry out an invasion, the ability to finance something like that, yeah, that is 100% on fossil fuels, really.
John, you've been reporting a lot on Canadian banks. Well, you've had some articles out. I happen to know that you're digging into it really deeply and that you've been looking at it a lot. And I can tell our audience listening in tonight, we have a lot of amazing reporting coming from you in this area. Can you tell me about the Canadian banks' investment in Russian oil and gas?
Yeah, so you're right. So there's Canadian banks, and so we're talking RBC and CIBC and things like this, as well as other major financial institutions like Manulife Insurance. Altogether, it was found that there is about $140 million Canadian that these financial institutions had invested in Russia's Gazprom, Lukoil, Rosneft, the fossil fuel giants.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I think the reality here, to be clear, right, is that that kind of money is not changing the calculus on
No.
Russia reportedly gets about $500 million
Mm-hmm.
in revenue every day from its
Mm-hmm.
fossil fuels, or it was in the fall anyway, before the invasion. So 140 million is not moving the needle. But a lot of advocates, a lot of people I've been speaking to anyway, they make the case that, well, Canada is responding with a suite of actions. I mean,
Yeah.
everything from diplomatic moves with our allies
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
symbolic gestures.
Mm-hmm.
So why not? That's their point. Why not?
And other countries, can you unpack that a little bit for us? What are their investments?
Right. So I mean,
the U.S. in particular.
Just going to say, like any good Canadian, there's really only one place to look, right? Yeah, the United States. I mean, the United States, they're closer to $6 billion in those same three companies, the Gazprom, Lukoil, Rosneft. It was $5.8 billion, and that's invested by companies like Fidelity, BlackRock, JP Morgan Chase, really, Wells Fargo, really sizable financial players. So those are some of the moves we've been seeing as well. But there's also like all the financial fossil fuel, American fossil fuel companies as well, who are doing significant business, and a few Canadian ones too, which I think we'll be getting into later.
And do you think that the current crisis really, I mean, this is the question of the evening tonight, is this going to speed the world's shift to renewable energy, or is that wishful thinking?
So yes, yeah, yes, I do think it will, but I think there's some really important things to watch here.
Mm-hmm.
So fossil fuels take longer to deploy, new projects in this case. Like Canada is not going to build a new LNG terminal to supply Europe with liquefied natural gas in a time frame that is relevant to this crisis. Solar panels, wind power, renewables, that stuff tends to be a little more nimble. It can be deployed a little bit faster, but it'll still take some time, right? This doesn't happen overnight. So the issue that we're in right now with the invasion is Europe is trying to figure out how can we reduce the leverage that Russia has over us. How can we do that in the short term? And so the International Energy Agency, it is the world's leading authority on this. They put out reports every year that companies, businesses, or governments, everybody pretty much bases their investment decisions on this. And they put out a 10-point plan for Europe that said, here's how you can, here's how you can reduce the leverage that Russia has over you within a year. And it is a lot of, it's upping a little bit of LNG capacity. So there's fossil fuels there. But it's no new contract with Russian oil and gas, kind of an obvious one. Heat pump deployment, right? Like a lot of things in the climate world, as I'm sure a number of the people watching, are going to be familiar with. Often the answer is boring old energy efficiency. The power you don't use is the cleanest power that you have, and it's the cheap power you have. It's the stuff you don't use. So turning down your thermostat by a little bit, on average, would save Europe a lot of energy. There are other options that they're considering, though, like scaling up their nuclear power. There's a bunch of nuclear plants that were going to be taken offline this year. Maybe push them a little bit longer is kind of the attitude that we're starting to see.
I'm seeing a lot of people commenting that it's amazing what a country can do when it wants to quickly, and the idea that we have to have our targets out in 2030 and 2050. Do we really need those targets out that far?
No, we absolutely don't. And we're seeing it very clearly. I mean, I believe it was Germany just the other day said, committing 200 billion euros to pull forward some of these decarbonization goals. I mean, these are really significant investments to do that. And I mean, to shamelessly plug another one of our columnists, Seth Klein, right? I mean, his book, A Good War, talks a little bit about this as well, where if you can take kind of a warlike footing, by which he means an emergency footing, then a lot's possible, right?
That's so interesting, and I hadn't really made that connection, but you're right. I mean, his whole thing is we need to adopt a warlike, strategy and attitude towards solving the climate crisis. And that's kind of intersecting now with actually being in a moment where there is a war. We're at the brink of being pulled into that war, and we've still got to solve the climate crisis.
And the only other, it absolutely, and I mean, they absolutely can do this if they go on that war footing or that emergency footing. The big challenge, the thing that I'm looking for, is that there's kind of a dirty secret out there for the other option. A lot of the talk is, well, should we scale up fossil fuel imports? Should we scale up renewables? We should be scaling up the renewables for all sorts of reasons. But the dirty secret here is that Europe does have an option to reactivate some of its coal-fired power plants that they already shuttered or already started closing. And that is an option that some of them are starting to talk about, because no one wants to, you need electricity, but that could be another big problem to look out for. So they're looking for ways to mitigate that.
Yeah, the problems are so complex, and just seemingly as we go forward, piling on top of each other. Max, I want to turn to you now and ask you a very simple question. In your mind, is this the end of fossil fuels? I think that was the headline in one of your columns.
Well, I know it's not the end of fossil fuels. We're going to be using fossil fuels for 10, 20, 30 years out into the future. The question is it the end of fossil fuels as we know them? And I think in that respect, this is going to prove to be a turning point. I'm out here in Calgary. The discourse out here is very different from the discourse in Vancouver and Toronto and Ottawa. People here are quite convinced that this is the proof they've been waiting for, to open the eyes of those Laurentian elites and get them to finally build pipelines. And of course, that's not what's going to happen. And as John and Natasha both pointed out, even if Justin Trudeau could snap his fingers and produce a pipeline in 6 months, it wouldn't really help Europe in the situation that it's in, because then we'd have to add production, fill those pipes, ship them to Europe. Like, it is a solution that does not actually address the problem. But if you're an importing nation, if you're China or you're India or you're any of these other countries that do not have any oil and gas resources or very minimal resources, and spend a lot of your foreign currency, a lot of your US dollars importing oil and gas, you're going to notice what is happening right now. You're going to watch prices going to $120 a barrel. They've settled down a little bit. But you'll watch what's happening to Europe and the choices that politicians are being forced to make there. And you're going to say, I don't want to be in that situation. I don't want to have to make bad political choices because the alternative is something even worse. And so they're going to increase their renewable goals. They're going to try to insulate their economies from, oil going from $60 a barrel to 120 in 4 months, 5 months. That is just not something that an importing nation wants any part of. And I don't think that the people out here realize that. So, in the near term, in the next 3 to 5 years, I happen to think it's actually going to be a very good time if you're an oil and gas executive out here. Prices are going to be good. Your stock is going to go up. It's going to be a lot better than it's been recently. But underneath all of that, your industry is going to be profoundly changed by what the Russians have done And the projections for peak demand of oil, which depending on how you look at it, late 2020s, early 2030s, I think those are going to start moving up, because you're going to see this investment in places like Europe and Southeast Asia, where they aren't going to want a part of this. And that the argument I always hear as well, look at the population growth. It's such a booming economy, and the thing is, they're not required to use fossil fuels the way we did. It's not like they have to go through this sort of energy stations of the cross where they have to go from like coal to gas to nuclear. Like they can just skip right over it, just the way they did with landlines. You look at developing nations in Africa and Asia, they just went straight to mobile phones because it was cheaper and better. And the same thing's going to happen with renewable technology and energy. It's not going to happen overnight. And I do think that anyone who thinks that we can sort of phase out fossil fuels in the next 5 years is not paying attention to politics. And politics in North America are a way bigger deal than I think a lot of people, including Seth Klein, seem to want to give credit to. I worked in the climate change office in Alberta. I saw what happens when you don't pay attention to politics. What happens to good climate policy. And you look at the United States right now, it is going to get very ugly very fast when it comes to energy and climate policy because of gasoline prices, because of oil prices, and it puts the Democrats in an impossible situation.
Yeah. Wow, Max. Okay, so much to unpack there. I want to go back to what you said about the oil executives, and then I have a question for you about oil workers. So, basically, you painted a picture where if you're an oil executive, you should be saving money now because there's going to, later, it's going to be that same old boom and bust thing in Alberta. But where does this leave the oil workers in Alberta?
I mean, that's the interesting thing, isn't it? In previous times when oil's been triple digits, it's just been a bonanza for workers. They've been building new oil sands projects. They've been able to name their price. You could be a high school dropout and make well into six figures. And that just is not happening. It has profoundly changed. And we saw that with the jobs report recently. There was I think a jobs report for February, and it was blockbuster for Canada. We added, I think well over 100,000 jobs. Alberta actually lost jobs, full-time jobs, because the oil industry is not hiring.
Isn't it also because they're starting to use more technology to replace what humans used to do?
Not starting. They've been doing this for 15, 20 years, but
they're actually phasing out jobs through the use of technology.
If you can take a drilling rig that used to take 12 people and replace it with technology that requires 2, you're going to do that. If you can take those giant hauling trucks from the oil sands that are a huge safety issue, and you have to pay people to drive them, and you can drive them autonomously, you're going to do that. So they've been doing this all throughout the downturn from 2014 to basically a few months ago. And they're not just going to hire people for the sake of hiring people. There was a really interesting piece in Bloomberg a little while back where the CEO of one of the big shale companies said, I don't care if oil prices go to $200 a barrel, we're not increasing our production because our shareholders, our investors have told us, we do not want you to grow. We've learned our lesson from that. We want you to give us the money back in the form of dividends and share buyback. So this is an oil boom unlike any we have ever seen, and it will end unlike any we've ever seen.
How will it end, Max?
I think it will end with a whimper, not with a bang. I don't think prices are going to crash down to $10 a barrel or anything like that, because OPEC has proven, I think, pretty adept at managing the market over the last few years. But the number of jobs is going to continue to dwindle. The industry here in Canada is going to kind of become sort of a manufacturing style business where they're not growing production, they're just maintaining for as long as the demand is there. And I hear folks saying that Canadian oil is very expensive, and it's true that it's expensive to build an oil sands facility, which is why they're not doing it anymore. But to maintain the ones that they've already built, it's cheap. Yes. It's $20 a barrel. They can keep those things running for a very long time. So that will be the shape of the business going forward. But politically, there's no jobs to offer people because they're not going to be there.
Okay, Max, thank you for looking into the crystal ball so clearly for us. That's kind of a sad prediction. However, I want to take a little break for a moment, and just first of all, remind everybody that I'm Linda Solomon Wood. I'm the editor-in-chief of Canada's National Observer, and this is Conversations. And those of you on the call that are subscribers, I really want to thank you so much. We couldn't do what we do. Our reporters could not do the great work they do without your subscription. So thank you so much. This evening, we're talking about intersecting crises, the war in Ukraine, the volatile oil market, and climate change. And for those of you who aren't subscribers yet, we rely on reader support. So I hope you'll join us. And if you don't know, we're driving the conversation about climate change in Canada. We keep it front and center, but we're also working to fight misinformation and manipulation with our reporting, and we help readers connect the dots about Canada's changing climate. So now a few more questions from Canada's National Observer's lead columnist, Max Fawcett. Okay, Max, so how you've talked about this a little bit. Could you say more? How is this time different than other times? We've seen high oil prices before. What makes this so different?
So in the past, it's been a pretty clear economic signal. The producers see high oil prices and they drill. They sanction new projects. They invest. They want to add more oil because back in the mid 2000s, back in the 80s, back in the 70s, nobody thought that demand for oil was going to really go down. We were worried that we were going to run out of oil. That was the big fear, is that the world would run out of oil. Peak demand was not really a consideration. Now they are all aware, grudgingly. They don't like it. A lot of them fight it. A lot of them, especially if you go down the org chart a little bit, they deny it. But they've been made to realize by their investors that the demand is going to peak. And when it does, the impact on their business will be transformative. So they can't keep adding production into, can't keep adding water into a bathtub that's full. And so this time, you have prices well over $100. Usually they would be sending crews out. They would be trying to get every, free person in Calgary out into the field. They're not doing that this time. Number one, they can't find people. It's really apparently really hard to find labor for these service companies because people have been burned so many times by, leaving another job, going to work for an oil field services company. There's a downturn, they get fired. It's a real unpleasant boom bust cycle for the workers. And a lot of the workers have just said, no, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to go work for a solar company. I'm going to do wind installations. I'm going to work, I don't know, as a teacher. There's a lot of things they can do. That old economy here where you could drop out of high school and make 150 grand a year is gone. And trust me, there are people in Alberta who are very angry about that. That's why you see, the rise of far right politicians here, why Jason Kenney is sort of always messaging to them, why the trucker convoy really kind of gathered most of its strength from Alberta, because you have a lot of angry people who don't like the way that the economy is changing, but it's not going to change back.
We have questions pouring in from the audience. And so Max, I'm going to throw this first one at you, but John and Natasha, I want you to, jump in when you want to add something. So Teresa Clinton asks, what does Max mean when he says it's going to get very ugly in the USA?
I think the Democrats are going to get treated very poorly in the midterms this year. I think they're going to lose the House. I think they might lose the Senate. And they will probably lose the White House in 2024 at this rate. The inflation that's in the economy down there, gasoline prices, record high gas prices. The Democrats are on their heels, and they don't really seem to have much of an answer on any of this stuff. They're upsetting their climate base in their party because they're not doing enough there. The Green New Deal stuff has been kind of pushed off to the side, and they're upsetting, the sort of moderate, quote unquote, voter who, does get really affected by things like gas prices and inflation. So, if you have Donald Trump again as president, or some Trump-like person, I think we all understand how bad that is for climate policy. And so I wish I knew a way out of this for Democrats. And if I did, I would tell them, but I'm very worried about the politics. I'm less worried in Canada simply because the conservatives here are much less competent and more inclined to shoot themselves in the foot. But even here, I think we all look at Pierre Poilievre and think there's no way he could ever become prime minister. I would not be so sure about that. With some of the headwinds that are building in the economy right now, with inflation, with sort of Justin Trudeau's lingering lack of popularity, I think the brand is a little tarnished there. You put the chips in the right order, and I could see Poilievre winning. And same thing there. Then we're going to undo all the work we've done on climate policy under the Liberals, as unsatisfying as it may be to some people, and we're going to go backwards. And we cannot afford to go backwards on this. Not even an inch.
I think, never say never in politics. Like so many people said, Trump could never win. Okay, I'm going to turn to John with a question from Lauren White. John, all of our SPs and pension plans are invested in helping the world heat, drive, make plastics, clothing, furniture, everything. How do we change this without freezing, eating cold food, and walking everywhere? Good question. Sean.
Yeah, so the question, we have a lot invested. How do we pull off the transition in a smooth and orderly way, as effectively it? I think like the unfortunate reality here is that the time for a smooth transition is gone. People have been talking about this for decades. The first time climate targets were set were, in the late 80s, and we keep missing them, right? That was the time when a smooth, painless transition would happen. What we're looking at now is a choice between how much we want to mitigate, meaning reducing the emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere. The more we can mitigate, the more we can bring emissions down, the worse climate change is. At the same time, we also have to start thinking about adapting. We need to figure out how we can brace ourselves for the damage that we've already locked in. And we briefly mentioned the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out recently, just the other week. And I mean, it's a devastating report. It is unequivocal that we have to transition now, or else we missed the window where where a dignified life is possible for people, for people around the world. And I mean, it sounds extreme, but it isn't. We are sometimes the government here and in other countries, but sometimes the government, we hear about holding warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's the Paris Agreement goal. We talk about that as the goal that we're aiming for, but we also talk about net zero by 2050. And sometimes they talk as if they're interchangeable, but they're not. The science is clear that we're on path to pass that 1.5 within the next 8 to 13 years. So we need to cut emissions significantly right now if we want to hold on to that. If we want to hold on to safe level warming. I guess like the nut graph here, like the point of what I'm trying to say is the transition is going to be expensive to pull off, but it will be more expensive if we don't.
I read as much of the IPCC report that I had time for, and now weren't they saying that they were talking about 2.5 and 3 degrees of warming? I mean, they had some pretty dire predictions of what might happen. And I think the part that was devastating that I read was, it was like a fact sheet. They had they had a series of like 10 questions. You could go look at it. The most common questions, commonly asked questions, one of which was, what will happen to my children and grandchildren? And in that, they painted a picture that was, we still could change things for them, but that within 2 lifetimes, things will be just, radically different on the planet.
Yeah.
And their lives will be different.
Yeah, we are really running out of time to prevent, well, actually, you know what, let me take this back. Every degree matters, right? Every fraction of a degree matters. So I don't want to say running out of time, because there isn't any point in this whole crisis where
Right.
it's worth throwing in the towel. It is
Mhm.
always worth bringing emissions down. However, the reason why the Paris Agreement goal is 1.5 is because this is an understood threshold for what we consider a safe climate. Once we start pushing past that, and I mean, it's already, let's also be clear, I'm here in British Columbia right now. Hundreds of people died here last year during a heat dome that was caused by climate change. Whole towns were destroyed by wildfires. People lost their lives in flooding. Like, it is here, it is hurting us right now, right? But if we pass that 1.5, if we cross that dangerous threshold, then we start having to deal with tipping points. There's several tipping points that we know of, and these are things that if we cross them, we lock in irreversible damage. So
Mhm.
things like melting permafrost is going to release billions of tons of methane into the atmosphere.
Mhm.
That is something where even if humans start changing our behavior in really transformative ways, that's a big problem.
Yeah.
Same with same with weather patterns. Like, we are literally changing weather patterns. That is going to affect crops. It's going to affect agricultural yields. It's going to affect transportation, storms, everything.
Mhm.
And just because I mentioned crops, I just do want to quickly call attention to a worthwhile point I saw in the comments. I'm not going to go scrolling for the sake of everything right now, but someone had a good point to mention wheat exports that are going on right now with the war, because we've talked about the security impacts of fossil fuels. Obviously, crops are going to be affected from climate change too, but we're staring at a major food crisis right now. Ukraine and Russia are massive wheat suppliers. And obviously the war in Ukraine, the war for Ukraine is hurting its ability to sell into the world market. And Russia being cut out of the global economy is making it harder for them to export as well. This isn't so much of a problem for a country like Canada, but for other countries like Yemen, that's already like in a serious crisis, this is going to be devastating. So this is, it's all interlocking is really the point.
It's, we're here tonight talking about, climate change and the Ukraine, and, there's a lot of tragedy. And one of the things the IPCC report brought up was the role of disinformation in making it so hard for governments to do what they need to do and to get public buy-in for it. Natasha, you've written some about information issues in Canada. And so I'm just going to throw this question at you from Stanley Lee. But I invite, Max or John, you to jump in afterwards. Natasha, Stanley Lee is interested in how to win the information war on disaster opportunism.
That's a really good question, and I actually spoke briefly about that with Stephen Guilbeault just when I was talking to him about the energy crisis Europe is experiencing. And I think essentially what it comes down to, at least on a government level, we need better communication, he said, between people like himself and everyday Canadians. He readily admitted that he thinks, especially on the climate and environment file, the government hasn't actually always been that effective at communicating some of these key issues to Canadians. And I mean, of course, it doesn't help when you have a federal party who, who still has a very contentious relationship with the existence of climate change. That is certainly a barrier. And so I think he thinks there's a lot of work that can be done from the government side in terms of putting things into simpler terms and more showing people how it will impact them in their everyday lives, which, fortunately or unfortunately is what this latest IPCC report did. But he really wants to be taking that approach with everything, trying to really break it down to those essentials. And so that's one piece of it. But I also spoke to Catherine McKenna and Elizabeth May about, because another issue, John talked a bit about how partisanship, toxic partisanship is another one of those key barriers that the IPCC report identified as a really significant barrier to climate action in North America. And so, that goes back to what we're seeing in question period. And I think it was Elizabeth May who told me we've switched from over the years, there's been a shift, and now opposition parties are really just there to sort of make the government look bad. There's not the type of collaboration that we need to deal with these interlocking crises. And evidently, this is serious enough that the IPCC identified it as something we need to address. And I mean, like John is saying, every minute, every day counts.
And did they specifically call out Canada in the report?
No, it was more broadly about North America, from what I remember. But because I mean, as you would know, Linda, the U.S. of course is embroiled in the same issues. But I think anyone looking from the outside in at Canadian politics can see that there are some pretty clear issues there.
Natasha, was there anything else Elizabeth May said that really stuck out from you? I mean, she's been there, she's brought this issue forward so many years ago in Canada and has just stuck with it all these years. And so is there anything else you could share about her perspective now as we're, seeing this war with Ukraine raging and tragedy unfolding?
Yeah, definitely. She always has plenty to say. Most notably of which is simply the fact that, like John was saying earlier, no one in Europe is asking for Canadian energy exports right now. And it's really disingenuous for politicians to be wailing on that talking point when there's no truth to it, because at the end of the day, there's other things we could be doing to help. We can argue all day about whether we're doing enough, but the fact is what the Conservative Party is pushing for is really not on the table at all, and is sort of detracting, from some other serious issues that we could play a role in.
Okay, thank you. And Max, I've got a question here for you from Carolyn Guimond. Carolyn, I'm sorry if I butchered your name. Carolyn asks, militaries are reliant on fossil fuels. Is anyone thinking of a green army, aside from going back to the cavalry? Max, do you have anything to say about that?
I do. I also want to build on Natasha's point, but I'll answer this question first. So the U.S. military is thinking about building a green military. They have identified climate change as a security threat to the United States, and the accessibility of fossil fuels as being a potential sort of tactical issue. So they have people within their command structure that have admittedly not many of them, but they have people in there that are developing options for, sort of renewable powered machines, assets, what have you, because they understand they can't be ideological about climate change. They need to be practical, and they see the risk, they see where it's coming from, and their job is to defend their country. So, this thinking is out there, in some perhaps surprising places. As to the question about how governments communicate, it's good that Minister Guilbeault understands this. Some of us have been trying to tell them this for 5 years, 6 years now. I'll give you a really good example with the carbon tax and rebate. I spend hours every week telling people there's a rebate, and they genuinely go, "Oh, I didn't know that. Where do I find it?" And I have to explain that it used to be on their income tax returns, and you have to look for it. It's actually called a climate action incentive. And they go, "Oh, well, my accountant never told me." Like it is self-injury by this government and its climate file to have not sent people physical checks with the rebates on them, right? I understand that's not efficient. I understand that it's, a waste of taxpayers' money, but people who care about climate change and who want good policy to win have to be willing to not play it straight and safe all the time, because conservatives do this every day. They play for the win. They don't play to play fair. And
it makes me think about Trump dollar, like when Trump would send out like tax rebates or just $1,000, to Americans, and it was signed Donald Trump.
Yep. I mean, corrupt, wrong, unethical, effective. And I
Right.
just don't think that, and I saw this in Alberta as well with the climate leadership plan. We definitely got our message through to the elites, the opinion makers, the climate wonks. They loved it. It was amazing policy. We did a terrible job of communicating it to voters, to people who actually had a hand in deciding whether it would endure. And I think we're seeing the same mistakes being made by the federal government, and it makes me very, very nervous, because we know that the climate or the carbon tax and the carbon rebate is a net benefit for 8 out of 10 households that get it. But those households don't know that. And they are going to vote in ways that does not support that. So, it makes me nervous.
I hear you. Tom Cullen mentions that BP has declared they'll exit their position in Russian oil and gas majors. With the stock market closed, and really, John, Max, Natasha, any of you welcome to jump in on this. With the stock market closed in Russia, how will this exit really take place? So is BP just greenwashing? Is this real, or what should we make of this?
No, so their shares are listed on the British, the London Stock Exchange, and depository receipts on the U.S. exchange. So their shares are being traded. They've taken, I think, a bit of a hit from this. They have to write down the asset. They're basically just walking away from a joint venture that they did with Rosneft, I believe. They've decided that the reputational risk of remaining there is far greater to their stock. So I think that it is good to see companies taking this seriously. The European oil majors are way ahead of North American companies on this stuff. Like, they are transitioning much more aggressively, deliberately, transparently. They're including, not just upstream emissions, but scope 3 emissions. They're playing the game correctly. And what we should want is for investors who feel like they need to have exposure to energy, because let's be honest, over the last 6 months, it's been the best asset class to be invested in, that they choose the right companies. They choose the ones that have the best climate plans, that becomes a differentiator. And I think that's what BP is going for here.
And John, what would you say to this?
Yeah, I think what we're watching is just big write-downs, right? Companies are exiting out of these deals, and if they take the hit, they take the hit, but they're considering it worthwhile for for any number of reasons. I think the thing that I would also call attention to, though, is this is what a lot of people think is going to happen with the energy transition too, right? There's going to be a lot of asset write-downs. There's going to be a lot of reserves that can't be developed. We already know that we have more oil in the reserves than the planet can take. So some of it's going to have to stay in the ground. Most of it's going to need to stay in the ground. And what's that going to do for the fossil fuel companies who consider that it's part of their assets, and also especially what's it going to do to their lending? Because a lot of these fossil fuel companies, they're engaged with what they call reserve-based lending with the banks, which gives them the access to the capital to be able to build these projects in the first place. So these write-downs, I think, through the energy transition, this is kind of a sneak peek of what some of that stuff might look like. I did just want to quickly add one thing about the military thing, because I thought that was an interesting question. And yeah, countries are starting to look at that and develop, green jet fuels and whatnot. I would just quickly also add that a bit like the energy efficiency comment I had a little bit earlier in the evening, where the cleanest energy is the energy you don't use. The greenest military is the military that you're not using, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think there's a lot of people who would like to bring sort of that anti-war justice element into the climate justice circles too.
Okay, so this is a very core question that comes from Kathy Code. And Kathy asks, and I'm going to direct this to you, Natasha, and then I'd really like to hear from all of you on it. She asks, how can we get government to quit subsidizing the big oil and gas corporations? I would reframe that a little bit, although please answer both of them. What is in the way of them doing it? What or who is in the way of the government stopping subsidies to big oil and gas, Natasha?
These are all great questions, and I think there's a lot of things that are in the way. For one, I mean, Canada exports a lot of oil. That's, like especially for the average Canadian, those can be hard things to sort of reconcile. I mean, we see how this manifests out west, and then we have politicians who are feeding into those fears and really turning this into an issue that is so polarized. So you end up with half the country who thinks we need to do away with subsidies, and another half who thinks the opposite. And I think we've also sort of seen in BC, like, who the governing party doesn't, they tend to change their tune, to allow more fossil fuel infrastructure expansion and export. The BC NDP has let a lot of people down who hoped for better and hoped for more of a transition-minded, policy framework. And so I think it really comes down to possibly other countries holding us accountable. Right now, Canada is undergoing a fossil fuel subsidy peer review process with Argentina. And we're currently, there's not a set time limit on it, but we are taking a bit longer than other countries have done to go through that process. So everyone's kind of eagerly awaiting the results of that. But it really remains to be seen to what extent that will even address the problem, because our government has committed to phasing out, of course, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But that doesn't apply to things like orphan well cleanup that can sound great, but when you actually break it down and look at how these companies are spending the money, what companies the money is going to, and whether it's actually achieving any of the stated aims of these programs, a lot of it is really revealed to be nothing more than an inefficient subsidy. So I am eager to see what comes out of this peer review process, and I'm hopeful that that can get things moving in the right direction, but that remains to be seen.
Well, thank you, Natasha. That's a really great answer. And Max, what about you? What's your view of this? How do we get government to quit subsidizing them?
I guess my view, and it's possibly a little bit unpopular in this audience, but I will proffer it all the same. I don't think it's worth the effort and attention that environmental groups put into it. You could get rid of every subsidy, quote unquote, that the fossil fuel industry gets right now. It's not going to change much about their operational makeup, especially at $95 WTI and $5 gas. They don't really need subsidies. We can take them away. We should, but I would much rather see us focus on giving subsidies to renewable energy, to doing what it takes to get those industries off the ground, and use the existing subsidy framework as a rhetorical argument to say, look, if one sector of the economy gets this one should as well, especially since this is the future of the energy system. The amount of energy, political energy, that it takes to fight the fossil fuel subsidy issue versus the benefit to the climate, I just don't think that it makes a lot of tactical sense. I think there are better hills to die on, better fights to pick.
So I'm focusing on getting the government to subsidize clean energy rather than getting them not to focus oil and gas, although maybe we could do both. John, what's your view?
My view is, well, the question is, how do we get them to stop? How do we get them to stop subsidizing fossil fuels? I think we kind of need to have a real sort of serious grappling with the fact that I don't think they really do, right? I think they've made some commitments around it, but the Liberals are not in any particular rush to do this. And we see them talking about more subsidies, particularly with the carbon capture and utilization storage credit. This is a really major ask. And essentially what we're talking about here is paying for a technology that would let the companies, capture and sequester carbon This would help reduce emissions, and there could be an environmental argument for subsidizing companies to help lower emissions. However, with the carbon capture tax credit, we did some reporting on this. The carbon capture facilities and the types of things that we're talking about funding are going to be massive costs to the public, and like just some examples, I mean, like a massive carbon capture trunk line. I mean, there's some estimates pushing, like some ask is like 50 billion from Ottawa to pay for this. I would also point to things like just about every hydro dam that's ever been built in this country, every pipeline. Mega projects go way over budget. This would be another major mega project. We should expect it to go over budget if they do it. But it all comes down to, I mean, what it really all comes down to is where you fall on the question of polluter pays. Should polluters pay for it? And that is actually a principle that is enshrined within Canada's environmental laws. So that is something that we've legislated, that we believe in. But when it comes down to it, I mean, we're more interested in pumping more money, in those companies' directions.
John, thank you. All of you, we're coming to the end of our hour, but before I let you go, we might go over 1 or 2 minutes, because before I wrap up, I'd like to bring you all back to the core question that we've come here tonight to discuss. And that's really the war in Ukraine and what kind of impact it's going to have on either helping us move forward and getting off fossil fuels, or is it going to drive us backwards? And so quickly, if you could all just weigh in on that and how you see that, that would be great. John?
I think that this is going to be a big turning point. It's going to be a big turning point on a number of different things, where it's going to be a change it's going to have implications for foreign policy, of course. It's going to have implications for trade. It's going to have implications for energy. These are all climate related. I really think we're emerging into the era where we are going to, I hope, correctly start understanding that climate is not an issue to be siloed off. It is an issue that connects the issues. It is the crisis. It's a poly-crisis. It is multiple crises coming together, giving us a very difficult situation to work through. In the face of that, the choice in front of us is either get started or not. And to me, that's an obvious choice.
Thank you. And Natasha, what the question is really, is this going to move us forward towards getting off fossil fuels, towards renewable energy, or are we going to see Canada move backwards?
Yeah, I mean, I won't repeat anything John just said, and I'll keep it quick. I think that, as globally, this will move us forward because Europe is being forced to reckon with this, and it's sort of do or die. What I worry about, though, is whether Canada is going to follow suit, because we are not in the same position of relying on Russian oil and gas. And so, we need to think seriously about whether this is something that can allow us to jumpstart our transition, or whether we're going to, keep standing by that type of rhetoric that we need more Canadian energy in the form of oil and gas, or, we can actually do something about it and change. And I don't know, I'm not sure how hopeful I am about that yet. And I think we'll sort of see more from our politicians on whether that's something we can expect, or whether we are going to stick with the status quo.
Thank you so much, Natasha. And Max?
Well, I think it depends on where you are. So if you're an importing nation, if you're Europe, if you're Asia, countries in Asia, this is a transformative moment for you. It's a wake-up call, and you will start to do everything you can to disassociate and decouple yourself from the fossil fuel industry. Bearing in mind that costs of energy matter, and you won't sort of do it at all costs. But this is a turning point. If you're a producing country like Canada, it looks a little different, right? And that's why we're seeing the rhetoric that we're seeing out of Alberta and conservatives in Ottawa and they're not going to go away. They're not going to stop with this. What I would say to everyone else is hold your nerve, and understand that the global markets, supply and demand will do the work here that we need it to do. The importing nations, the one that demand it, are now sort of pivoting. They're going to make a change, and that is going to have an impact on us here in Canada. And we may not see it in the next 6 weeks or 6 months, but I promise you, in the next 6 years, we'll look back and realize that this was, a crucial moment in our history as a country, and maybe it was when we started to decarbonize, maybe against our will in some parts of the country, but still do it all the same.
We'll end there, Max. Thank you so much. Max, John, Natasha, really appreciate you being with me tonight. And all of you on the call, really appreciate you spending time with us. Tonight's episode was produced by Mary Beth Dean and Shadayar Tajvidi at the Canadian Centre for Journalism, with the support of my colleagues, Janelle Johnson and Sadie Stevens. And once again, thanks Natasha, John, and Max for making time to join us tonight.
Happy to do it.
Thanks.
Do
guys.
it
This
again
was
next
great.
week.
Yes, we got to keep doing this. And for all of you still on the call, if you would like to see us do more and help us out, go to nationalobserver.com/subscribe and purchase an annual subscription. If you're already a subscriber, buy a gift for a friend. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for joining us.